Let me just welcome everybody. Thank you all for coming. This is exciting. It's our first virtual FAC forum that we are doing. And we've got a really interesting talk lined up for today. The person I had talked to you about giving us our opening prayer wasn't here. So Tavita, can I put you on the spot and ask you to give us an opening prayer to start things off? Was that a no?
We might have to unmute him.
Okay.
Oh,
Thank you.
Father in heaven, we're grateful for this time that we have to come together for this FAC forum. We're grateful for the opportunity that we have through technology to connect and to be able to continue to discuss topics that are important to our university, but also to increase our knowledge and continue to think of ways to increase research and help our students. We're grateful for people who have taken the time to go out and research and share their research with the rest of us as a faculty of BYU Hawaii. We say these things humbly in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Okay, so as we get going, let me just say that the next couple of these FAC forums we have lined up, we've got Kate McClellan, who's going to talk to us in the next one, I'm not sure exactly which of her projects she's going to talk about. She's done some really interesting research. And then we're also going to have a FAC forum coming up where we're going to talk about the new professorship that the university is going to institute. Let me also say that these forums are really a great opportunity for us to kind of increase the strength of our network, to develop an academic culture, to share what we're doing with our colleagues. And if any of you have anything interesting that you have been doing, or maybe you've got a project that you're working on and you want some feedback, then please, you can contact me or Charles Bradshaw or Spencer Ingley, or your FAC representative, and let them know that you have something that you would like to give in a forum. So today our talk is Spencer Ingley, who is an assistant professor in the Faculty of Sciences. He teaches biology classes, including natural resource management, and he's interested in the processes that drive the origins of biodiversity. And he has published in the journals Evolution, Current Zoology, and Animal Behavior. And recently he had a really interesting opportunity where he spent some time down in Antarctica. And so today he's going to talk to us a little bit about some of the work that he did there. And his talk is entitled "A Tropical Ecologist in Antarctica, Tales from the Ice." So Spencer, thanks. Take it away.
Thanks, Rand. So I actually pre-recorded the talk to make sure that I stayed within time and didn't stray too much. But I'll make a couple quick notes before we get started. We will have some time for Q&A at the end. I'll be happy to take any questions. If you think of questions along the way and you want to drop them in, or at any point really, if you want to drop them in the text, the chat function, if you don't want to unmute yourself and show yourself, but you want to ask a question, that's fine with me. But yeah, hopefully you'll enjoy it. I'm really grateful for FAC for inviting me to do this. I was invited to do this before I was on the FAC, and then now that I'm on the FAC, I was a really easy target for the first virtual FAC forum. So I think Charles is going to share his screen now and start up my video, and we'll see you guys in a little bit for Q&A. Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for joining me today. The talk that I'm going to give today is titled "A Tropical Ecologist in Antarctica, Lessons from the Ice." So as my title suggests, I'm an ecologist who has worked primarily in the tropics for most of my professional life. About 20 years ago was the first time that I went to the tropics. I spent the summer on this island, the island of Ometepe. It's a volcanic island in Lake Nicaragua. And as a young man, I was fascinated by the diversity that was there on this island. Following that summer in Nicaragua, I started visiting family in Hawaii. I served a mission in Ecuador I lived in Hawaii for a little while right after my mission. I then spent part of my undergraduate degree doing research in Costa Rica and Ecuador, and then spent my entire PhD doing research in Panama and Costa Rica. And throughout this time, something that I've been able to witness over this sort of 20-year period is both the incredible diversity that's found within the tropics, but also how fragile these ecosystems are and how in many ways they're under threat by human activity. I started to observe some of these threats on my mission firsthand as I drove through what seemed like hours of these profit-focused palm oil plantations that had replaced priceless stretches of Amazon rainforest and coastal rainforest in Ecuador and throughout many of our tropical regions. And so this was sad to me, even before I was an ecologist, to see, this beautiful, diverse landscape that serves so many functions being replaced by a landscape that is, this sort of monocrop, this single function unit. And as I started here at BYU Hawaii, I became really hyper aware of the issues, some of the environmental issues that we are subject to here in the Hawaiian Islands. Right after starting my position at BYU Hawaii, I spent a week or so on the Big Island doing research. And part of that trip, I went out to visit Camilo Point on the Big Island, which is a remote beach, but one that is incredibly polluted. And this pollution comes from the ocean. And that ocean pollution comes from across the globe, much of it from Southeast Asia. And I visited this beach with the director of the Hawaii Wildlife Fund, Bill Gilmartin, who's been working on this beach for a number of years. And he told me that the first time that they cleaned up this beach, that they went out and started to work on this beach, they removed 50 tons of rubbish. And that year after year, they remove about 30 tons of rubbish. And all this rubbish is just washing up from the ocean onto these shorelines in Camilo Point in this incredibly remote area. And since then, that had a really big impact on me. And since then, I've started to be more interested in this issue of plastic pollution from both a research and a teaching standpoint, and also just in terms of my personal life and how I'm influencing this issue as an individual. So last September, when a student of mine told me about the Airbnb Ocean Conservancy Antarctic sabbatical, which would focus on studying the impact of microplastic pollution on the frozen continent, I couldn't pass up that opportunity to apply. And one reason that I wanted to apply was because I saw these parallels between Hawaii and Antarctica, where both of these areas are incredibly remote. They're both very much isolated from the rest of the planet physically, yet they are under threat by activities that are taking place across the globe. And to my great surprise, after a written application and after several rounds of interviews, I was among the 5 participants selected from over 140,000 applicants. I couldn't believe that number, from over 200 countries. And so I'm going to tell you today a little bit about that research expedition that I went on this past sort of mid-November to mid-December. And I'm first going to tell you a little bit about the participants on that trip, the mission and the science background of that trip, some of the preparation work that we did in Chile, life and research in Antarctica, how we get there, life at Union Glacier, this camp that I spent 10 days at, life in the field, lab work in the Berg, and then a little bit about the future directions. So the 4 other participants that were selected for this expedition, along with our science lead, Kirsty Jones-Williams, and the entire support crew that we had, were absolutely stellar to work with. And I could spend literally an entire talk talking about what they've done and who they are and the amazing things that they continue to do. But I'm just going to briefly introduce them here. So Rasha Saleh, who's on the right there, she's a Palestinian refugee. She lives in Dubai. She leads environmental outreach programs for the World Wildlife Fund. Tia King, who's 2 individuals over next to Kirsty Jones-Williams, who's our science lead, who I'll talk about a bit more later. She is a recycling and humanitarian activist from Arizona. Vivek Vashist is the founder and of an experiential learning startup in India that is focused on environmental issues. And then Chesti Os is the Director of Sustainability at Yara International, which is a global leader in crop nutrition and also ocean health issues. The goals of this project were aligned broadly with issues related to global plastic pollution and their ecological impacts. Okay, the challenges that we currently face on this front, this issue of plastic pollution, started back in the 50s, and they stem largely from what we sometimes refer to as the plastic paradox. And this plastic paradox is this idea that plastics are durable, versatile, and cheap. And what that means is that they're really easy to produce, and they can be produced and used in many, many, many different ways. And starting back in the 50s, they were marketed as this way to sort of increase our standard of living, to sort of adopt this throwaway lifestyle, as was advertised in this shocking article from Life magazine in 1955. And in many ways, plastics have transformed our society and the way that we live, in some ways, very good ways. But the problem is that because plastics are so durable and so cheap and so versatile, they have been used so much, and they are really difficult to get rid of. And so that's why we call this plastic paradox, right? It's what's driving this issue, both from a commercial standpoint and also from an ecological standpoint. So since then, since the 50s, we've produced 8 billion metric tons of plastic. We've produced 350 million metric tons in 2017 alone. And that number that we're producing, that amount that we're producing each year is only going up. And this has resulted in what is literally a global crisis related to plastic pollution. And nowhere is this issue more readily visible than in our oceans. And that's because our oceans have become, in large part, either intentionally or unintentionally, a dumping ground for plastic pollution. Each year, 8 million metric tons of plastic flow into the ocean. And some of this happens just through runoff. So if you drop something, let's say on the BYU Hawaii campus, and it gets swept down a storm drain, that doesn't go to an area, that doesn't go to sort of a filtration center or a water treatment plant. That flows straight out into the river and then straight out into the ocean. And that's how most systems are set up. Most stormwater systems are set up around the country and around the world, if they even exist. And this is the equivalent, and this is just a mind-boggling amount. This is the equivalent of one garbage truck full of plastic being dumped into the ocean every minute. So imagine, on a Monday, every other Monday, when the recycling truck comes around and he drives through Laie and he fills up his truck all full of plastic and all this other debris. And then imagine he went out and dumped it into the ocean. And then imagine that was happening every minute of every day of every year. This is a huge problem. And we've been told that if we recycle, that will kind of fix this problem, right? But the sad truth is that only a small fraction of what we recycle actually gets recycled. And I won't go into that issue today, but that is a major issue that needs to be addressed, and something that has really been a marketing ploy on the part of the plastic industries over the past several decades, and it's worked incredibly well, and we've just gobbled up plastic thinking, hey, we can recycle it, and this is going to save everything. But in fact, that's not actually happening. And sadly, a huge portion of the plastics being deposited into the ocean come from just 5 countries, and all of those countries are within the target region of our university. And that's an opportunity, I think, for us. So collectively, these countries, China, Indonesia, Philippines, Thailand, and Vietnam, contribute about half of the marine plastic pollution. And that is largely because they lack systems for capturing and managing their waste. And that also results from the fact that we have been selling, much of the developed world has been selling our plastic to China, and now since China stopped purchasing it, some of these countries in Southeast Asia, we've been selling them our plastics, and they, in some cases, are recycling them, but in many cases, they just get dumped out into the ocean, either directly or indirectly. And the effects of marine plastics have become pervasive. So recently, plastic waste was even found on the seafloor of the Mariana Trench, which is almost 11,000 meters deep. And this image right here just gives you a little bit of a reference of how deep that actually is. That's much deeper than Mount Everest is high, and that's deeper than that difference is bigger than the difference between the cruising altitude of a commercial airline. Okay, so when you're flying up in a plane to the mainland or wherever, you're not flying as high as the Mariana Trench is deep, and we found plastic pollution at that level. And one reason that this issue of plastic pollution is so bad is that plastics are impacting wildlife at every part of the food web. I grew up seeing images like this of, animals being sort of strangled by, soda can rings and things like that, and little bits of net, and that's a huge issue, right? And when I was a kid, I cut those soda rings up, and I thought I was solving the problem, and that does help, but plastics are affecting wildlife at every stage and at every size. So you've got birds that are consuming and other animals that are consuming mesoplastics, these small bits of plastic that look kind of like their food items. And as a result, they get filled up and then they stop eating actual food. They can't pass that plastic and they just die. You've also got microplastics and nanoplastics being consumed by organisms that are at the base of our food chain. And those are being passed up the food chain and having an impact that is very broad. Collectively, there's over 800 marine species that are documented as being impacted by plastic, and this is also affecting humans. So there have been some studies that have found, for example, 28% of all individual fish in an Indonesian fish market have plastics in them. And you might think, oh, this is just an Indonesian problem. That makes sense. It's this, there's plastic pollution is really bad over there. But this is also a problem for us as well. 25% of individual fish sampled at a California fish market were found to have plastics in them. Other things such as shellfish are also being found to have microplastics in them. And so we're consuming likely not insignificant levels of microplastics. And there are several potential side effects of that. So the frontier of this problem right now is in the polar regions. And the major question that we set out to answer in this project is, to what extent have microplastics reached the interior of Antarctica? And I'll tell you a little bit about why that was the focus in particular. So there's been other work that's found microplastics in the water surrounding Antarctica. And while some of this is almost certainly coming from local activity, most appears to be coming from distant parts of the world, much in the same way as our plastic pollution on our beaches is not really necessarily a local issue. It's not coming from local sources. But we don't really know the extent to which microplastics have reached the interior of the continent. And you might be asking yourself how they get there, especially in these places where they're completely uninhabited, where scientists and expeditioners are not even going to these places. There are a few possibilities. There have been some studies recently that have found synthetic fibers in atmospheric fallout and microplastics in snow that has been found in really remote parts of the Alps, for example, in Europe. And so this provides, sort of a possible avenue for introducing microplastics and these small microfibers into the sort of the deepest of the wilderness in Antarctica, if we have it sort of coming in literally from the atmosphere. And the reason that this matters, there's not a lot of life, there's no life in the interior of Antarctica, but the reason that this matters is that snow and that atmospheric fallout that's potentially bringing microplastics to the interior of Antarctica is becoming ice, and that ice is forming parts of glaciers, and those glaciers are all slowly moving towards the ocean. And in many cases, those glaciers are moving more quickly towards the ocean than they have in the past due to climate change. And so what we have here is this kind of latent reservoir, or the potential for this latent reservoir of marine plastics, so these microplastics that are accumulating in glaciers and then would be slowly deposited into the ocean over time, potentially for decades or centuries to come. And then once those microplastics are deposited into the ocean, they'll likely be readily incorporated into the diets of foundational species in that area, such as krill, and then they'll be passed on across the food web, and the impacts will be felt globally. And so for this trip, my copy of In Patagonia in hand, I set off to Chile to begin this expedition. And after over 24 hours of traveling, a few days in Santiago, we ended up in Puerto Natales, Chile. This is a gorgeous part of southern Chile, of Patagonian Chile. And this was the site of some of our training and outreach that we did prior to departing for Antarctica. So Puerto Natales is a small town, but it's famous because it's well known, or it's attractive because it's the gateway to Torres del Paine National Park in Chile. And this is where we did some of our sort of training, physical training, and also some science outreach with Torres del Paine Legacy Fund. So this is an absolutely incredible place. It's absolutely beautiful. It's been named a number of times, mostly by sort of like travel organizations, as the 8th wonder of the world. And in the age of internet, Instagram and Facebook and Twitter, Torres del Paine National Park has become a huge magnet for ecotourism. And that's not always been a good thing, in part because the park isn't set up to handle the infrastructure. It doesn't have the infrastructure to handle the quantities of people that are arriving. And there have been several tourist-caused fires, forest fires in recent decades that have burned hundreds of thousands of acres of native forest down there. And so part of the work that we did was monitoring the progress of several thousand trees that have been planted as part of a park-wide reforestation effort, which thankfully is going fairly well. After our time in Puerto Natales and Torres del Paine, we traveled to Punta Arenas, Chile, which is at the sort of the southernmost city in Chile, where we completed our preparations. Punta Arenas is one of 3 major gateways to Antarctica, the others being in South Africa and New Zealand. And that is where our logistics company, Antarctic Logistics and Expeditions, is based. And from Punta Arenas, we departed on the Aleutian 7 cargo plane for a 4.5-hour flight to the interior of Antarctica, which is the site of Union Glacier Camp. So Union Glacier Camp is one of its kind. It's the only camp of its kind operating on the entire continent, and it serves as a hub for researchers and explorers around the interior of the continent. And the main reason that this camp is located there at Union Glacier, which is in the Ellsworth Mountains and the Antarctic Range, is because of the blue ice runway. So there's a large exposed surface of Union Glacier that is used as a landing point for the Aleutian 7. So you come in on this giant cargo plane, this Russian cargo plane. You can't even see out the window. There's no windows. And you land on this blue ice runway. And immediately you feel like you're on another planet. I've never felt so unplugged from the modern world in my life as when I got off that plane and realized that I was in Antarctica. I stepped onto that blue ice runway, and that was it. So once we're in that camp includes, as you saw in that video, other transportation services, vehicles, and planes that then can take individuals to different places throughout the continent for research or other activities. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time telling you about life at Union Glacier Camp. Sorry, there's a photo issue there. Let me see if it'll... Oh, didn't pull up there. But that should have been an aerial photo of the camp, which you'll see in a minute. The camp is spectacular. It is fairly primitive, as you might imagine. It's set up and taken down every year, and everything there is temporary. But the camp has everything you need for survival, including the world's best field doctors. You see things like this major incident IV fluids cooler sitting around, and which might be a little worrisome, but it's reassuring, I think, to when you're in the most remote place in the world, to know that you have excellent medical, the potential for excellent medical help and evacuation if need be. So I'm gonna let this video play here. So this is kind of a walk through or a ride through Union Glacier Camp. So this is me leaving the Johansen tent. All the different tents are named after Antarctic explorers. And I'm riding here on one of the many fat tire bikes that are located throughout the camp, which is kind of the preferred mode of transportation within the camp. So these are the guest tents. They're double walled, just nylon wall, but they are quite warm, especially if it's sunny and nice outside, which it was 24/7 when we were there. They can even get up to 50 or 60 degrees. So those are the bathhouses you saw there, where you can take your one shower every 3 days due to sort of the cost and difficulty of producing water. You have to melt all your water. These are the bathrooms. They're basically glorified porta potties. There's no running water. All the waste that is collected is flown out every season. So there's actually absolutely nothing left, no human waste left behind. Even the expeditions that are climbing up to the summit of Mount Vincent and other peaks, they pack out all of their waste each season, which is not the most coveted job at the camp. You'll see there on the left, there's a small runway, which is just a snow runway for the smaller planes, the Twin Otters and the Basslers, which fly missions throughout the continent. There's a couple of dining tents. There's other tents that are used for staff meetings. The buildings there on the left are used for, those are sort of research facilities and also kitchens. So that's the little local terminal, I guess you could call it. These are the staff tents. So there's quite a few staff that help keep the camp operating, and then also lead the different expeditions and guide different expeditions throughout the continent. You're basically always with the guide, and the guides are extremely good, extremely well qualified. And then this is the Berg. This is our makeshift lab that we set up there in Antarctica to process these snow samples that we're working with. So traveling around Antarctica is an incredibly difficult task, but one that's made possible by a fleet of world-class vehicles, such as the Snow Tucker, which is there on the left, and then also 4x4 snow vans. We spent a lot of time driving around Antarctica in these vehicles to reach some of these remote field sites. When you're in the vehicles, you have to follow areas that have been monitored with radar. So basically, they'll go out in ski-doos with a radar to find the crevasses, and then they mark out each year kind of the safe paths that can be used by the vehicles. We also took several planes around different parts of the continent, including Twin Otters, to collect places such as the Antarctic Plateau and 3 glaciers. And we also took the Bassler, which is a plane that flies down each year from Canada and kind of hopscotches its way to all the way down to Chile and then to Antarctica. We took that plane down to the South Pole when we went there. So that's the Bassler on the bottom left and one of the Twin Otters on the right. Those are my first time flying in bush planes, which was very, very different from flying a commercial aircraft, but quite the experience. So while the Tuckers and the vans and the snowmobiles were great, if you know me, you know that I'm an avid mountain biker, and so the fat tire bikes were my personal favorite. And in addition to using them to get around the camp in our free time, which was typically after 10 or 11 o'clock at night, this bike ride was happening about 11 o'clock at night, we'd go out and ride some of the roads that had been marked as safe, just to get a little exercise, a little bit of the continent that a little more difficult to be. So we spent most of our time out in the field collecting research samples. So I want to tell you a little bit about what life in the field is like. That was the primary goal of this expedition. The first thing that I'll mention is safety. So if you look in this picture, you'll see that we all have harnesses and ropes and other safety equipment. And that's because in many cases we were going sort of off of the marked paths, and we were going into areas that potentially had crevasses. And so because we're on a glacier is basically a frozen river. And just like a regular river has areas of turbulence and areas that are somewhat unstable or more sort of violent in the rapids, the same happens with these glaciers. And so you get areas where you get these huge cracks, these big crevasses in the glacier, and you never know where they are, or you don't always know where they are, because sometimes they get covered up with snow, and they'll form sort of these snow bridges. And so you might be walking along, and it might look totally safe, and then you fall through the surface snow, and then you're dangling in a crevasse. And so we walked in teams of 4. We did extensive training to make sure that we were capable of retrieving a teammate, or sort of climbing out of a crevasse ourselves with the equipment that we had. And so that was of the utmost importance. Most of our days were spent collecting snow samples from the field. And this is a little bit of a taste of what that looked like. So we were generally sampling in areas that were about 1 to 2 kilometers squared. And so we'd walk through the snow, a few hundred meters between sampling points. We had 2 different teams, each of which would collect a sample from each site. So we had a replicate, and we also collected weather observations and other sort of significant environmental data that we do later on. When we get to a site, we'd have to sort of gear up. One of the things that we'd have to do, this is, you can see me doing it here. This might look like I was getting ready for COVID, but this is actually to prevent, sort of shedding fibers from some of my gear, some of my gloves while I was digging and processing samples. So we dig down typically to about 40 centimeters, so that we were getting, not the most recent snow that had been blown over, but snow that had been there for quite some time.
Okay, not 40 centimeters.
Once we got down to that depth, we would sort of clear out the surface snow, any surface snow that we had knocked in while digging the hole.
Bottom cleared.
And then once we had cleared out the bottom, we would fill up our aluminum sampling container with as much snow as possible, which we would later take back to
closing
the lab for processing. You can hear me commenting there, noting sort of when I was opening, when I was closing the jars, and that was so that we could sort of get an idea of how long those jars were open, in case there was any sort of contamination coming in from ourselves. So there's quite a few things, quite a few steps actually that we took to reduce contamination or to identify contamination from our own equipment. And sometimes the snow wasn't so easy to dig in. Sometimes it was quite frozen, and so we'd have to use ice axes, as you can see here, to get down to the depths that we needed. So we sampled in many different sites across Antarctica, about 85 sites in total, which was more than we expected or more than we were hoping to collect from. And that, in large part, was because we had incredibly good weather. You never know what kind of weather you're going to get in Antarctica, but we had, sort of these bluebird days our entire trip. And at times, the temperature was actually approaching freezing. In some locations, it was quite a bit colder. And at the South Pole, for example, it was -30, which was less than pleasant, a little bit of a surprise for my body. But for the most part, we had incredibly good weather, and we're able to sample very effectively throughout our sample areas. One of the most amazing things for me was that in some of these areas where we were collecting, we were likely the first humans to ever set foot in these sites. So you can see us here. This is a photo that was taken from a drone by the photographer that was along with us. Here we're sampling at 3 glaciers, and there's a small camp that you can see off in the distance. And that camp itself has had fewer than only a couple dozen people that have passed through that camp since it was built, since it was set up just a few years ago. And out on this glacier where we were, it's likely that no human being has ever been out there. And so we were walking in places literally for the first time and collecting snow samples in these areas. And so, it'll be really interesting to see in the end what types of samples we get, what types of pollution we get in these incredibly remote areas where we're literally the only people who have ever been there. Speaking of remote sites, we did take this plane, the Basler, on a nearly 4-hour flight from our already remote camp to the South Pole. We collected snow samples at the South Pole. We visited the ceremonial and the geographic South Pole while we were there, and we also toured the Amundsen Scott Research Station, which is a U.S. field station, a beautiful facility down there at the South Pole, which was a huge honor to be able to tour that, because it's very uncommon that you're able to do that. Well, mainly because it's really hard to get to the South Pole, but normally they don't let anybody in there. So at the end of each sampling day, which were long days, we returned to the berg to process our samples. our science lead, Kirsty Jones-Williams of the British Antarctic Survey, trained us in this process. And briefly, what we would do is essentially we'd melt down our snow samples and then we'd pass each sample through an incredibly fine aluminum mesh filter. And this would filter out anything that's 3 microns or above. So this is very, 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 very small. And so what we ended up with was dozens of these little filter papers that would capture any debris that was in our sample. And the next, and you can see on some of these, you can see here in this bottom left here, this is a glacier that's near the main camp. Oops, sorry. And you can see here there's a little microfiber on it. You can see other little specks. So there's actually, you can see quite a bit. In many cases, you can see little microfibers or plastics or other substances that are sort of being filtered out from the snow sample. And we do have to still remove statistically any potential contaminants. And we sampled from our clothing and we made sure that we sort of knew what we could potentially be shedding, the nature of the plastics that we could potentially be shedding in our own samples, even though we were trying our best to avoid contamination. So we can kind of filter that out in later stages if need be. The next step here is to scan each of these filters with this Fourier transformed infrared spectrometer. And basically what this does is it shines infrared light on a substance, okay? In this case, we're shining it on these filters, and it'll scan the filters and it'll identify sort of these chemical signatures, these almost like fingerprints that different types of plastics have. And what that'll tell us is how much and of what and what kind of plastics are found in these different samples. And then we can compare those sort of chemical signatures to databases of known microplastics and try to identify the sources of those microplastics. Sadly, this was something that was supposed to happen back in April, and COVID, as it has disrupted this process, as it's disrupted many, many other processes as well. So we're still in the process of working through these samples and getting those data for publication. So what's going to happen in the future here? This project was touted in part as a citizen science project. So citizen science projects are typically involve regular people collecting data for scientists in their communities. And there's obviously no citizens in Antarctica. But the idea was, while we were in Antarctica, we set up this base, at this base camp, we set up this remote lab, and we trained staff and crew from the base camp, from Antarctic Logistics, in these collection protocols. And many of these people actually have advanced degrees in science, so they're very capable. And what they will do in future years is allow visitors to this camp, people who are passing through this camp to do science or to do exploration in their downtime, to go out and to collect snow samples and process them back at the lab. And so our data ends up being sort of a baseline estimate of what there was at this point in 2019, and then we can continue to monitor what's happening in the years to come. So it's really a citizen science project like no other. Another goal of this project was to, in our partnership with Ocean Conservancy, to become, as participants, ambassadors for the issue of ocean pollution. And so each of us was able to work with sort of the leaders of Ocean Conservancy and some of the chief science advisors of the Ocean Conservancy and develop sort of individual ambassador plans. And as part of my plan, I plan on partnering with local agencies and non-government organizations to support science work on marine debris, also increase participation in what's called the International Coastal Cleanup, which is a day each year that Ocean Conservancy organizes, where many, many, many people, hundreds of thousands of people participate across the globe. But there is not a lot of participation in the Pacific. And so my goal is to sort of work with islands across the Pacific to help increase participation in that effort so that we can continue to monitor and identify the sources of these problems. And then also do public outreach in our community on waste reduction. So in closing here, so talking about the state of our environment oftentimes can be a downer, okay? whether it's climate change or ecological collapses or mass extinctions that we're witnessing across the globe, or microplastics in Antarctica, it can be a little bit depressing. So I wanted to end on a higher note, on an optimistic note. This expedition involved people from all over the world, and people who were incredibly accomplished and who had done really incredible things. So just as an example, I've got pictures of two guides here on the left. Lapka Sherpa is on the top left. He's from Nepal. He was one of our guides throughout the trip, and he's climbed Mount Everest over 20 times. And this is a guy, so before coming here, I've never met somebody who had climbed Mount Everest. And in this camp, it seemed like everybody had climbed Mount Everest. Robert Anderson in the bottom left was one of our other guides. He's the only person who've ever solo climbed the highest summit on every continent. So this group of people that we worked with and that we interact with helped me realize and sort of remember how capable human beings are. If we could do all of these amazing things, we can, if we put our minds to it, and if we put our collective efforts to it, we can accomplish monumental tasks. And this includes solving some of these environmental crises. So now, back in Hawaii, when I go to Hukilau Beach or some other beach and I see plastic washing up on the shore, I try not to think of this as a negative thing. I try not to think of, how dire the circumstances are. I try to think of the great opportunity we have here at BYU Hawaii to bring together people from across the Pacific who are being most impacted by this issue and try to empower them with the tools and the motivation to return to their homes and affect monumental change that could be felt across the oceans and across the globe and for generations to come. I want to thank you all for joining me today and listening to sort of my account, my experiences and lessons I learned from this trip. And I look forward to answering your questions now during our live Q&A, or if you'd like to contact me in some other way in the future, I'd be happy to talk to you more about Antarctica or the issue of microplastic pollution. Thank you all. Okay, thanks everybody. I think it's back to me. So I'm happy to answer any questions anybody has. I see Neil Anderson dropped a question in the chat box. What are 3 things that I could do here in Hawaii to have a positive impact on the reduction of microplastics in the world? So that is a fantastic question. One thing that I didn't talk about was kind of what are the major sources of microplastics. So the 2 biggest sources of microplastics might actually come as a surprise. And there's actually 2 categories of plastics, microplastics. When we think about them, there are primary microplastics, which are objects that are small from the beginning. And then there are secondary microplastics, which are sort of degraded pieces of plastic. So over time, plastic doesn't disappear, but it does break down into smaller and smaller and smaller pieces. And you notice that if you go to the beach here in Hawaii and you see these tiny fragments of larger containers. So that's kind of a secondary source of microplastics. The number 1 source of microplastics in the ocean is actually microfibers. So these are small fibers that get dislodged from clothing items for the most part that are made out of, that are plastic based. So if you think of things like polyester and nylon and rayon, these are all plastic based materials. And when we do a load of wash, hundreds of thousands of microfibers are produced in a single load of wash. And that wastewater gets sent to the wastewater treatment plant, but the vast majority of wastewater treatment plants, even ours in Laie, which is actually a really good wastewater treatment plant, they don't have filters that are small enough to filter out these microplastics. And so then those microplastics get passed back out into the river, out into the ocean, or percolated down into the ground as most of our wastewater is handled. And so that's the number 1 source of microplastic in the ocean. That accounts for about 1/3 of microplastics that you find in the ocean. So one thing that you can do is when you're thinking about either the clothing or the bedding or other material that you're purchasing, try to purchase materials that are natural materials. And there are problems associated with natural materials as well. There's, when you buy a shirt or a pair of jeans, there were literally thousands of gallons of water that went into producing that pair of shirt or those jeans. So that can be problematic as well. So you have to be careful about what, where you're sourcing your clothing and everything. But that's one way to sort of reduce the amount of microplastics that you're flushing out into the ocean through your clothing. There are other steps that you could take as well so that you can keep wearing your, your polyester Aloha shirts and so forth. There are filter bags that you can buy that you can put your clothing in. It's almost like a lint filter, and it will catch it'll sort of filter out these fibers that are being dislodged from your clothing as you're doing wash. There are in development filters that could be eventually put on washing machines and hopefully at wastewater treatment plants that would catch those microfibers before they get flushed out into the ocean. The second biggest source, which is actually to me even more surprising, comes from our tires. So car tires are made out of plasticized rubber, and if you have ever owned a car, you know that your tires wear down over time, and the tire that's wearing down as you're driving over the years is not just disappearing into thin air. It's being sort of shed little by little on the roadway, and then that is then washed out in our storm system into the ocean. To my knowledge, there aren't any sort of options on the market, or there aren't many options on the market, at least for non-plasticized rubber tires. But that does make a case for driving less and using public transportation, which has lots of other benefits as well. So those are two things I guess I would recommend. The third would be to just reduce overall your consumption of plastic, in particular single-use plastics. There are, plastics serve many, many, many functions, and many of them are vital, especially if you think about, sort of a healthcare industry and, technological demands and so forth. There are a lot of benefits to plastics, but many single-use plastics are avoidable, and those are future microplastics in the making. As I mentioned before, very small percentage of our plastic is actually recycled into new products. And so just turning off the tap essentially by stopping or reducing your consumption of plastics is a really good thing you can do as well. I've got a couple other questions. Neil says that Airbnb should sponsor a 5-year reunion. I support that. I'd love to go back to Antarctica. Anybody can go to Antarctica. It's just incredibly expensive. So Jeff Strain asks, what is the success with tracking where the microplastics came from? What is being done to collect or break down the microplastics that are already in the environment? So the first part there, it's difficult to impossible to know exactly where a microplastic comes from geographically, but you can, from these samples that we've taken and from the types of data we would collect, you can narrow down the type of microplastic that it is, and that can help you identify the source, not the geographic source necessarily, but the actual product that is resulting in that microplastic. In terms of what is being done to collect or break down the microplastics that are already in the environment, sadly, virtually nothing when it comes to microplastics. Because they are so small and because they're so pervasive. I mean, I hate to sound like a pessimist, but it's almost impossible to imagine a way that we could remove all microplastics from our ocean ecosystems, for example. There are efforts underway to reduce the amount of plastic in general that gets into the ocean, and then also to collect and recycle or reuse in some way sort of mesoplastics and macroplastics, so larger plastic items. There are a number of projects that are underway to do that. But when it comes to microplastics, they are so small and so numerous. I mean, we're talking about, in some cases, 100,000 or more microplastic particles in a cubic meter of water. And that's higher in some areas than in others, and incredibly difficult to remove. Let's see. Okay, so I think that's Leo Solis, my neighbor. She says, I liked your idea at the end of your presentation to educate students about plastic waste. Is something done already at BYUH to do this? This presentation has helped me to know this would be great for students as well. Yeah, so this is something that I know I discuss in some of my classes, especially my introductory classes. And I'm sure this is a topic that is discussed in a number of other classes within biology and likely around campus. There are other things that could be done and that I hope are done in sort of the near future. One of the other things that I do on campus is advise the Environmental Stewardship Club. And they've actually collected surveys and data over the past couple years related to, sort of the use of single-use plastics on campus. And so there's, we're sort of making the case that will be presented hopefully fairly soon to some of the administration to, particularly when it comes to sort of food services, ways that we can sort of reduce our footprint in that way. So that's one thing that's happening. Let's see. Karen says, what are a couple of suggestions you and your family do to reduce single-use plastics? So my wife has a little baggie that there's 5 people in our family, and she has 5 little sets of reusable silverware that she carries with her most of the time. Sometimes she carries her small purse, and so she can't really fit those with her. But we try to, when we can, especially when we're eating out, to sort of bring our own cutlery so that we don't have to use single-use plastics in that way. We use water bottles, reusable water bottles, as I know are very popular in Hawaii, especially the insulated ones that don't sweat everywhere. We've actually, my wife is really amazing on this front, and big shout out to her, especially for letting me go on this trip. She went through, as a lot of people do in Hawaii, we shop quite a bit at Costco, and one of our biggest complaints with Costco is the amount of packaging that things come in. And so my wife actually went through a few months back and kind of did an inventory of how much packaging and what plastic packaging was coming, what our food items were coming in. And we identified a handful of items that would be easy to replace, either by purchasing them at another location, sort of buying them bulk, or bringing our own bags to buy, things like produce and whatnot. And other things that we could start to make at home. So since then, we've actually started to we noticed that the tortillas that we were buying and the bread that we were buying came in sort of bags within bags within bags. And so I don't know if Neil Anderson is still on here, but Neil Anderson's wife, Kathy, makes an amazing homemade bread, and I got the recipe from her, and now that's our go-to. And so we do little things like that. We try to make food where we can to, sort of replace, Costco purchases that have a lot of packaging with sort of buying ingredients bulk and making them that way. Let's see, sorry. Okay, Charles says, can you let us know any of the preliminary findings from your samples? If not definite yet, any guesses from your observations? So almost certainly, it's hard to tell from our abilities that we've had there in the field. We were limited in terms of what we could actually detect on those filters. There were obvious signs of things like microfibers, and it's not 100% certain that those were from, the actual samples and not from sort of contamination from our bodies, from our clothing. But it's almost certain that there were, microplastics in some form or another in those samples. So Tavita says, what do you think of people returning to indigenous traditional materials to reduce plastic use? I think that is an amazing opportunity. I think there's a lot of potential for innovation innovation in some ways, but also, sort of learning from traditional knowledge, traditional ecological knowledge or other cultural knowledge in terms of storing food or producing food or growing food in ways that help us reduce our plastic use. I definitely think that's a great idea. And I'd be really interested to hear what you think about that sometime, because you know a lot more about indigenous traditional materials than I do. And if you wanted to unmute yourself now, if you had anything to add, I'd love to hear it.
No, I put up a link up there of some of the movements within the Pacific to return to traditional, materials.
Okay.
There's one that's prominent in Tonga right now, and also in New Zealand in Aotearoa. The one in Tonga is actually sponsored by a church, one of the, not our church, but another Protestant church, as part of their care for creation.
Wow.
So it's a very interesting that they're taking both a cultural and a spiritual dimension into it. So.
Yeah, and I think that is incredibly important, especially, I feel like, personally, I love the natural world and I'm fascinated by the natural world. And I've always had a very close relationship, personal relationship with the natural world. But I also think from, a spiritual standpoint, it is incredibly important to respect and to care for and to be good stewards of our environment. And I think I imagine some of the things that I brought up here today are news to some of you. And I think in many cases, we're contributing to these problems unknowingly and unwittingly. And I think that's why it's so important to sort of spread this knowledge as much as possible, so people are aware of, not only some of the sources of, this, pollution, but also some of the consequences. We might think, oh, it's not that big of a deal, or, oh, a whale here or there is, dying, or a sea lion is getting, strangled by a net, but it's much more pervasive than that. And I think it's devastating that we've done that to the planet, but I think we're at a point where we absolutely have to start thinking about ways to turn off the tap, first of all, to stop, our creation of plastics, especially single-use plastics, and to stop what we're doing to our oceans and the environment when it comes to plastics. Cleanup projects are great, but it's most important, I think, to just stop adding to the contamination that's already there. There's a nice analogy. If you had the bathtub plugged up, if you had the drain plugged and the bathtub was on and it was running and it started to overflow, the first thing you would do wouldn't be run and grab a mop or run and grab a towel to start soaking things up. The first thing you would do would be to turn off the tap. And that's, I think, most important right now, is to turn off this tap, this metaphorical tap, and stop, flooding our oceans with plastic, so that then we can try to restore some of those ecosystems as best as possible. Thank you for sharing that, Devito. Well, I think we're close to out of time. I would be currently shopping for a bread maker. I have a great recipe from a great source, if you would like our recipe. Neil can vouch for it. And probably a lot of you on this call, or at least a few of you on this call, have had that bread. I know Kathy takes a loaf to somebody every week. I was lucky enough to get a loaf one week and it converted me. So, well, thank you everybody for coming. I really enjoyed sharing with you and hearing your questions, and look forward to seeing you around and hopefully helping you help this issue in some way.